Okay, so good afternoon
Yeah.
to everybody from India, Assam. Uh, this is in this uh, paper technical session. We have got five presenters, and let me begin with the first presenter, Dr. S. Bharati. But before that, let me tell you, each paper presenters will be given eight, 10 minutes, 10 minutes for their presentation. So you have to keep the time in your mind and do accordingly. Thank you. The first paper presenter will be Dr. S. Bharati. She is assistant professor from Srinivas Ramanujam Center, Sastra deemed to be University, Kumbakonam, Tamil Nadu. And the title of the paper will be Representation of Islam in the Selected Novels of Amitav Ghosh, a study. Dr. S.
Good,
Bharati.
good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for your introduction, sir. So my title is Representation of Island in the Selected Novels of Amitav Ghosh Study. So basically, land and water, landscape and seascape, nature and culture, communication and isolation, land and islanders, all these are inseparable dualities. So my present paper focuses on the representation of islands as a major setting and dualities of marine landscape and issues in islands and a few key concepts such as island people, biocultural diversity in the selected novels of Amitav Ghosh. So my research basically highlights the portrayal of landscape, then it also deals with uh, the portrayal of islands as a backdrop for the plot of the story, and it is aimed at providing a broader perspective on how to use this island as a backdrop to undermine a plethora of meanings. The background of my studies, ghost fiction could be seen as culinary fiction, as there are plenty of references to food culture. Novels such as The Hungry Tide, Calcutta Chromosome, In an Antique Land, as well as his non-fiction works like The Imam and the Indian, Dancing in Cambodia. So all these centers around anthropology, history, culture, tradition, and myth. And coming to the story, most of his novels are based on human relationships. But what I propose to analyze here is uh, how he portrays uh, the sea and the adjacent lands in mainly his three novels. One is The Hungry Tide, other one is The Gun Island, his recent novel, and the other one is The Great Derangement, which is on the climate change. So the Hungry Tide is a detailed account of historical colonial as well as post-colonial settlements in the Sundarbans, which depicts the region, rich topography, and perpetually mutating places. The Sundarbans raises and addresses questions which should be at the heart of a critical meta-discourse of island studies. So, moreover, the selected novels they theorize the ideas central to island studies. This present research paper is on Ghosh's exploration of imaginary geographies of estuarine islands in The Hungry Tide and the relationship between the representation of islands in diverse textual fields and its contemporary geopolitical realities. So much of the research on Ghosh novels are about culture, narrative style, immigrant sensibility, suffering of people, as well as ecological issues in the environment. So, not much has been discussed on the portrayal of the landscape and about the Aboriginal indigenous islanders. So, the present study is an attempt to highlight Ghosh's art of picturing the island and its people in the selected fiction and non-fiction. In The Hungry Tide, Ghosh presents the landscape in poetical lines. I would like to quote the lines. The islands are the trailing threads of India's fabric, the ragged fringe of her sari, the achal that follows her, half wetted by the sea. So the novel mainly set in the Sundarbans and the lower region of the Ganges Delta that extends from the Hooghly River estuary in West Bengal to Meghna River in Bangladesh. The region referred to in the novel as the Tide Country. It is an immense archipelago. Islands are made and unmade in days. So, thus, the novel is set in a group of Indian islands and focuses on the island topology, culture, and politics. Many women, originally from Sundarbans, were portrayed as sex workers in the novel The Hungry Tide. So they were forced into this type of livelihood as they do not have formal education. So in the novel, in his recent novel, Gun Island, he highlights the pathetic conditions of the island women and how the government has taken initiatives to rehabilitate these women. So the another important factor here is the cyclones in Sundarbans in 2009, which has uprooted many islanders from the soil. There were cyclones in 70s and the 90s, but the cyclone Alia, named Alia in 2009, had a very great devastating effect, and it has made the land uncultivable. Once fertile land has been swamped by salt water, making them uncultivable for generation. So in the Sundarbans, it was so hot that the exodus of young was accelerating every year. So in the Gun Island, one of the characters, Moina, her son Tutul cannot find any suitable job in the Indian subcontinent. So he was brought up by Priya in Western style, and so he could not adjust to the situation in India. So he even changes his name to Tipu, as the Americans found it difficult to spell his name. So as he falls into wise, Priya, one of the protagonists of the story, sends him back to India. Here in India, the problem aggravates further when his schoolmates discover that he is a Dalit from the Sundarbans. So Ghosh demonstrates the fact that how island people are ill-treated by the mainlanders. Here I would like to quote the lines. One day a classmate had said to him that only servants and oars came from the Sundarbans. So this has kindled the anger in Tipu, alias Tutul, as it has touched his dignity as a fellow human being. Infuriated, he gave a severe blow to his classmate. So, as a boy who has beaten was from an upland family, Tipu was expelled from the school. So, the novel Hungry Tide is divided into two parts: the Ebb Bata and the Flood Jova. The Independent states about this particular novel as an intriguing tale of history, folklore, ecology, migration, love, and grief. The novel mainly deals with the Sundarbans, an archipelago of many small islands in the Bay of Bengal. So it is a powerful evolutionary story of people in these islands. Ghosh gives a picture of the islands through the following lines. The islands are trailing threads of India's fabric. Uh, I have quoted it prior. Uh, so they are these islands. They are numbered in thousands. These islands, some are immense and some are no longer than sandbars. They are very small. So while the others were washed into being just a year or two ago. So it shows these islands are unique in the landscape as there are no borders here to divide the fresh and salt water from the sea. So the novel here is set in two principal places. One is Lusibari and the other one is Garjantola. So these two locations are imaginary places. However, there are secondary locations such as Canning, Gozaba, Sajjala, Morichapi, and Emily Bari. So all these islands, they do exist. They are real islands. And the novel revolves around the protagonist Priya Roy, an American Indian marine biologist who comes to the Sundarbans to trace the movements of the cetacean Irrawaddy dolphins. So next, moving on to the Great Derangement. Here he talks about the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Ghosh writes that in Hungry Tide, that the climate change in the Sundarbans is what he want to call it as narrative imagination. So in his non-fiction, The Great Derangement, he talks about the effect of climate change in many of the Indian islands. Especially about the Andaman and Nicobar. Though they are neighbors, they are very different in their topography. The first in Andamans, it rises steeply from the sea, whereas the Nicobar Islands, they are very low-lying islands. So he also observes the effect of earthquake under the sea, causing tsunami waves that has set the foundation of houses in many islands, leaving the islanders as homeless immigrants. Even in the Gun Island, we could note that many immigrants from Sundarbans settle in Venice. And also, in the same non-fiction, there is a representation of islands of South Mumbai. Ghosh presents a whole new world of indigenous lands and its people in his fiction as well as non-fiction. So, in his much discussed work on climate change, he describes the landscape of various small islands that has formed the present Mumbai. Once in the British period, the estuarine landscape was
Hello.
connected.
Yes, sorry to interrupt, but you have to
Yes.
got only 2 minutes to sum up.
Yeah. So estuarine landscapes were connected with bridges, embankments, etc. It would never occur anybody that Mumbai was an island once. So in the Gun Island, again he talks about the island culture, and many of the novels have the backdrop of the sea, and in both the novels he uses the myth of the sea. And he talks about the effect of cyclone on these islands and how the islanders were affected by the cyclone. A study of his novels thus reveal the state of these lesser known Indian islands and pictures them in the world geography. It is also interesting to note that Ghosh writes more about the Sundarbans, a group of small islands in his recent novels. These islands seem to fascinate him, that they play a major role in his novels. So Ghosh, a compelling storyteller, could not help but admire the landscape of indigenous islands and thus bringing them to limelight through his works. So the present study is pertinent only to his recent works, and it is suggested that one should go beyond this and take up the earlier novels as well as his non-fiction works, so that one could have a comprehensive view of the islands and its people, which was not discussed by the other critics. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. S. Varati. Now we are moving ahead to the second paper presentation, and the presenter is Parvati P. She is a doctorate research scholar from the Department of Cultural Studies, EFLU, Hyderabad.
Hello.
Parvati P.
Yeah, am I audible, sir?
Yes.
Is it okay if I switch off my video because it is draining my data?
It's okay. No problem.
So the title of my paper is Indigeneity, Orality and Tribal Agency, a critical reading of KJ Baby's novel Maveli Mantra. So in this paper, I have tried to look at how the tribes, the Adia tribes of Northeast Kerala are depicted as a people with agency over their history. Another point of inquiry is to see how the novelist deals with the orality, myths, and songs of a tribal community to reclaim their history. And the third point of inquiry is regarding on how the idea of indigeneity that is emerging in the novel, so that the tribes can use it as a political tool. So as a short note on the Adia tribes of Wayanad, so these are a tribal community who are basically agriculturalists, and they belong to Wayanad, a district in northeast Kerala. So most of the works in history and literature that have come out on the tribes of Wayanad have categorized the Adiyas as a community of tribes carrying the stigma of ex-slaves. So they are either depicted as slaves or bonded laborers under the Janmis or landlords of Wayanad, and were often denied legitimate history and cultural agency. So the paper critiques this image of the Adiyas as slaves and discusses the identity of Adiyas as agriculturalists. So the first part of my presentation is orality as the legitimizer of tribal identity in Maveli Mantram. So the novel Maveli Mantram is set in the late 19th century and the early phases of the 20th century Wayanad, and it is an attempt at the revival of the songs, folktales, and orality of the Adiyas. So before going on into the discussion, I would like to give a short definition of the myth according to Jan Vansina in his study on oral traditions. So Vansina says that the myth refers to a timeless past, and they are accounts that originate out of speculation by local sages about these questions out of pre-existing material of the same nature, or borrowed from other communities and out of heavily fossilized group accounts. Traditions of origin are new accounts, and they may or may not remain stable over long periods of time. And now in this novel, the main myth that acts as a trope is the myth of Maveli Mantram. And Mantram refers to a place where the Adiyas lived under subjugation to one or two masters. And Maveli Mantram is actually the mythical land of a tribal king called Maveli Mantru, who lost his lands to the non-tribal outsiders. And this myth of Maveli Mantram inspired the primordial Adiya man and woman called Melocharan and Kiyurati to escape the subjugation and sow the seeds of this equality and liberty somewhere else. So, so the entire novel is based upon this myth, the myth of the primordial Adiya man and woman. So this this I would like to elaborate a little bit on the journey of these primordial Adiya man and woman. So Melocharan and Kiyurati, they belong to the Karipur fort where they faced adverse circumstances on the paddy fields of landlords, and they eloped from this fort and reached the Pakam fort owned by another Janmi who enslaved them. However, they were constantly pursued by a Hindu goddess called Mali, who pursued them throughout their journey to freedom. So finally, what happened is that this couple, this primordial Adiya man and woman, they were not able to attain the freedom and equality that they hoped to. So this mythical journey is reenacted by the protagonist couples in the novel called Kaipadan and Ira. And they also reenacted the journey of the primordial Adiya man and woman, but their journey brought them back to their own clan members. So this bringing the newer Adiya man and woman to their own clan is to assert that the tribal groups like Adiyas were the initial inhabitants of Wayanad and that they were colonized and enslaved by the non-tribal outsiders in history. And this larger mythical framework of Maveli Mantru is employed by the novelist to narrate the story of the present-day Adiya man and woman. So the journey of this Kaipadan and Ira in search of the lost Maveli Mantram, it is a fictional reenactment of the journey of the primordial Adiya man and woman, and it shows an Adiya community that had survived power structures like the feudal lordship, colonial rule, and democratic systems of governance. So the journey through the forest took this modern Adiya man and woman to a place called Mathura Chola, where they were reunited with their clan members. Some of the clan members feel that their dreams were also shattered, and they ended up just with their clan members. But one character called Javara Mopan actually says that their journey is not a defeat, but coming back to their culture, coming back to their tradition and myth is actually a victory for them, because they have actually learned to live according to their traditions, and they have actually succeeded in their journey to bring a new world of freedom and equality. So this reference to the myth again and again in the novel shows how a myth works. So myth is something that never dies, and it only undergoes changes as it passes from one generation to the other, and provides the oral cultures with a sense of liberation. So that is the part regarding the orality and myths. And next I move on to a discussion on Maveli Mantram as a space of indigeneity. So indigeneity in the paper, I have given two definitions. One definition is given by International Labour Organization as indigeneity is used to refer to some people who were the inhabitants of a country or a geographical region at the time of conquest or colonization. These people, irrespective of their legal status, live in conformity with the social and economic institutions of that time. And another definition that I have took is from Louisa Stuart in her study on the tribes of Kerala. She has defined indigeneity as not simply a falling back to myths and traditions. Rather, it has become a political tool that allows the tribes to present their own narratives to a neoliberal democracy. So the idea of indigeneity discussed here is mainly based on, here in this paper is mainly based on Louisa Stuart's definition of indigeneity as a tool of political agency. For instance, one of the characters in the novel, that is one of the Adia elders in the novel called Javaramuppan, he is presented as the perpetrator of the cultural traditions of Adia community. He talks of an independent community life based on food gathering habits and occasional cultivations by his ancestors. He says that it was the strength of the Adia legends that helped Kaipadan to escape the world of slavery. And otherwise, he would have simply ended up his life around those stories that justified slavery and the rights of the Janmis to own slaves. And such reflections on an indigenous space allows the Adia community in the novel to reimagine their mantrams as a space of freedom and equality. So this process of cultural reinvention through the remembrance and performance of the myths and legends of a particular community creates spaces of indigeneity. And Adias could claim agency both politically and culturally by claiming an indigenous status. And also in this novel, there are other references to the native musical instruments like kural and tudi that were used by the Adia community while they were engaged in their agricultural practices. The novel also throws up instances where the community is robbed of its cultural practices. At some point, the Janmis name their slaves' children. So the Adia children are named by the Janmis. The Adia children are taught how to hate their own language, and the women among the Adia women are exploited. They are sexually exploited. So these are the instances that are thrown before us by the novelist as we go through the pages. But the elder called Javaramuppan in the novel urges his clan members to build a Maveli Mantram which will be eternally free from slavery. So I quote from the novel. It is spoken by the character called Javaramuppan. My children, you are no more animals who are destined to work for the Janmis. You are the sparks that emanated from the fire of the Adia songs and tales. You can make new songs and tales and thereby ignite the embers in you. When one begins to think of making new songs, his world widens and his capabilities improve, and finally the language improves. And the last reference to indigeneity given in the novel is during the journey of the protagonist through the forest in search of a world of freedom. So throughout their journey, the couple finds liberation in their culture and not in any other power structures. There are references to other power structures like resorting back to the colonial plantations as plantation laborers. There are references to them becoming rebels under the feudal lords, against the feudal lords, and there are references to them becoming even Naxalite activists. But at the end, what happens is that the protagonist reach back to their clan members, their culture and their traditions to build a world of freedom. So the protagonist did not resort to any of the options that I mentioned just now, and they actually retreated to the forest. For them, neither the plantations nor Naxalism was sufficient to escape to Maveli Mantra, and they knew from their experiences that the new colonial masters would never be better than the landlords, as they used to visit the fields where the ideas work so as to learn how to make them work. So the myth of Melocharan and Kurati is it might be a failed attempt by the primordial Adia man and woman to establish a utopian world free of slavery. But such myths of failed attempts to build independent space of tribal culture is reiterated and reenacted and again by the modern day Adia man and women, and they continuously try to build a world of freedom and slavery. So this is the message that the novel gives, and the novel actually helps us to read the tribal history from their own perspective. It presents the tribals as a people with history and agency and with political power. Yes, that is all about my paper. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for keeping up with, thank you. You have maintained the time properly. And so now we are moving ahead to the next paper presenter. And Rabina Khanam is a research scholar from Mewar University, Chittorgarh, Rajasthan. And the title of the paper will be Politics of Memory, Trauma, Intercultural and Native American Identity in Fiction of James Welch. Rabina Khanam, please. Rabina Khanam. Is the paper presenter here, Rabina Khanam? Okay, maybe she's not around. So we can move ahead to the fourth paper presenter, Sonal Sharma, research scholar from the Department of English, Tantia University, Sri Gandhinagar. And the title of the paper is Amalgamation of Myths, Legends, and Folklore in the Select Plays of Girish Karnad, with special reference to Yayati and Nagamandala. Sonal Sharma.
Yes, sir. So may I present my screen?
Yes, yes.
I have a presentation, PowerPoint presentation.
Okay.
So I'm presenting my screen.
Sure.
Amalgamation of myths, legends, and folklore in the select plays of Girish Karnad, with special reference to Yayati and Nagamandal. So what is a myth? Myths deals with gods and goddesses, demigods, and supernatural beings. Ramayana, the logic, with a lesson. An example is the Katha Sagar. Katha Sagar is a monumental collection of legends, but in literature, myth and legend go side by side. They are interdependent, or you can say that their lacing is inseparable. So as Carl Jung has rightly said, myths and legends embody themselves in the form of motives and symbols, certain recurring patterns of collective human behavior and certain archetypal human experiences. Myths express certain archetypal social relationships. Now, as the third word of my paper, third most important word of my paper is folklore. Folklore is said to be the expressive body of culture shared by a particular society. It is a kind of oral history preserved by people of a large society. As you can say that folklore is no author as such. It emerges from cultural traditions carried forward by incessant and perpetual telling and retelling. Moving on to the next slide. Girish Karnad, as we all know, that he was a Padma Shri and Padma Bhushan laureate, Gyanpith awardee, playwright, actor, director, and translator. Myths and legends are the backbone of his literary theme. Prudently and purposefully, he has amalgamated myths, legends, and folklore in his plays. Now, Yayati, if I talk about Yayati, Yayati is the debut play of Girish Karnad. The story is taken from Adiparv of Mahabharat. Then Adiparv of Mahabharat. This story occurs in Bhagavad Puran and Shatpat Brahman. Shatpat Brahman is a commentary on Shukla Yajur Ved. Karnad has retained the characters from the original story, and he has retained the characters of Yayati, Puru, Devyani, Sharmishta, and Shukracharya. Shukracharya is known as the Asur Guru. Yayati and Puru are quite popular in Indian folk tales and legends. Devyani, Sharmishta, and Shukracharya are other important mythological characters. Asur Guru Shukracharya is a renowned name in Indian culture. Now, from Vedic literature, Mahabharata, and Puranas, if you see, Shukracharya's name is also mentioned in folk tales, fables, parables of different languages. The characters of Chitralekha and Swarnalata, there are two more characters in the play, Chitralekha and Swarnalata, they are Girish Karnad's own creation. In Mahabharata, if you see, the story of Yayati ends with the acceptance of Yayati's obedient son too. The play has ended here. By introducing the character of Chitralekha, Karnad has proved his craftsmanship. By creating imaginary characters and harmonizing them with mythological and legendary entities, Karnad has highlighted the contemporary issues like patriarchy, men-woman relations, complexities and responsibilities, expectations within Indian family. Now moving on to the next play, that is Nagamandal. Nagamandal is based on a Kannada folklore which Karnad heard from a poet and academician, A.K. Ramanujan. This kind of stories were told by women while they fed their children in kitchen. So it's a folklore. The play has 4 narrative levels. The frame story has 3 other stories. Each story entangled with the previous one. The frame story tells us that the days were so boring and monotonous, the audience often went off to sleep. So as a punishment, he was asked to survive for one night. The second and the third narratives contain political elements. The third narration is gossiping among the personified giggling flame. The narration level who are late due to some reason. The fourth narrative level is the story of Rani, the protagonist of the play. Now, there are 4 major characters in the play: Rani, Apanna. Apanna can be any man. Kurudava, Kapanna are the characters of the play. Storylines 2 groups: Rani, Anna, Nag, Rani, Kurudava, and Kapanna. Now, first we are going to, in short, I'll tell you the central story of this play. The plot is, the story is about Rani. Young Rani, recently married to Apanna, is locked in by her husband, who treats her as a servant. He regularly goes to a courtesan and returns in the night only. An old blind woman, Kurudava, who is always carried around by her son Kapanna, tries to help Rani by giving her a magical root. She instructs Rani to cook and serve it to Apanna with food. With the magical effect of the root, he will fall in love with Rani, she explains. Rani cooks the root and makes a pot, but did not serve it to Apanna. She pours it on the anthill, which is the dwelling place of Cobra. As a result of it, King Cobra falls in love with Rani. Enters the house through the drain in the bathroom at night and takes the appearance of Anna. The Cobra meets Rani every night. It results in pregnancy of Rani. When Apanna comes to know that Rani is pregnant, he informs the elders of the village about the infidelity of his wife, as he never had sexual relations with her. Rani proves her innocence by undertaking a snake ordeal. Surprisingly, instead of biting her, the cobra slides up her shoulder and spreads its like umbrella over the head. The people present there are awestruck. All except Rani's goddess and Apanna acts her as wife. So each group that Rani, move on to the slide, if you had paid attention, then Rani, Panna and form one group, and Kurura and Kapanna, they form so form triangle. Both the angles are intermingled. The sign of Indian symbolism. The section of triangles on upwards and downwards indicate the union and oneness of Shiva and Shakti. The ends first resembles the endings of fairy tales, where Rani, after proving her innocence spectacularly, is in goddess. Accepts her as wife about the moon's concubine, who gladly comes his way. This type end of angels and reads. The second ending includes the suspension of Anna and the state of the Mayura. After realizing the fact that Rani loves someone else, he wants to sacrifice himself. Cobra hides in the abundant hair of Rani and dies. But Flames did not seem happy with the death of Cobra. Hence, the narrator of God decides to change the climate of the play and make it appear Rani Apanna. This time, when Cobra falls from his hair, he is alive. Frightened Apanna thinks to kill the Cobra. Rani saved him by hide in her hair again. She explains Apanna that the Cobra has escaped. The play ends these emotional words of Rani. This hair is the symbol of
Hello.
my wedded live in there happily forever. The third ending of the play cannot be accepted by the Indian community because consider marriage as a supreme for a woman and offer salvation through service to her husband. A Kannad in this play projects position of a as a for situation for young girls in the joint family. His husband only in two connected roles, as a stranger in the day and as the lover in the night. In the Indian mythological cultural tradition, snake is an image of vital energy of cosmos. It symbolizes fertility process of development beings. Snakes or nagas are frequently portrayed as charming man or half man, half reptile. Mythological and folk tales are now used all side of Indian folk. In this context, it is really significant that white non-human character. The snake ordeal, this is something important like highlight. The ordeal of Rani reminds us of the fire ordeal of Sita in Ramayana. The magical route given to Rani by Kurudava also reminds us of Kunti of the Mahabharata, who was given a special boon of conceiving the pregnancy with the help of reciting some special hymns by a well-known king, Durvara. Kunti shares the boon with Madri. Kannad has reproduced this instance of Kunti and Madri in another form of Kurudava and Rani. Now, if you see, this is the graphic representation of the play, and through
Hello,
which
Sonal
you easily
Sharma.
understand the play.
Hello. I
Yes.
have to interrupt here. You are running out of time. Try to summarize within 1
Yes,
minute.
sir. Just
please.
two slides. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The number one is the ruined temple. Second is fire of flames. Third circle is acoustic wave of the song. 4A is this is the upward triangle, which shows Kurudava, Rani, and Apanna triangle. Downward triangle, 4B, Apanna, Rani, Cobra. Inner triangle, the triple endings of the play. So in the end, I would like to conclude that art uniquely and fruitfully amalgamated associated myth, legend, folklore plays Ayati Nagala. Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to present my paper in this international conference. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonal Sharma. Okay, now we are moving ahead to the last paper presentation, and the presenter is Pragya Ghosh. She's a PhD research scholar from the University of Delhi, and she'll be presenting on the topic Indigenous Inhabitants in Ancient Scriptures. Pragya Ghosh, please.
Thank you so much, sir. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting my paper on indigenous inhabitants in ancient scriptures. We all know that the Indian civilization is among the most ancient in the world and has long been home to hugely diverse populations and consequently the varied knowledge systems. Indigenous inhabitants form a major segment of this diverse Indian population. They are depicted as indigenous when they sustain the traditions, customs, and different characteristics of an early culture that is associated with a given locale. When we talk about an early culture, it is important to find out the traces or the evidence of this culture in order to be more familiar with it. And the first thing that comes to my mind to look out for evidence is in ancient Indian literary scriptures like the Vedas, Upanishads, Purans, or the epics. Since it is believed that everything in this world, be it the various knowledge systems, the way of living, lifestyle of people, what we ought to do or not do, different cultures and traditional practices, they all are mentioned in the scriptures. But is there any mention or reference about the indigenous inhabitants also in these ancient scriptures? Since some of these indigenous tribes are the most primitive living creatures, so does these ancient scriptures contains any information about their lifestyle, their way of living, their culture, tradition, customs also? It is observed that the ancient scriptures of the Vedic period contain some references of the tribal people, although it is uncertain about the number and names of the tribes mentioned in the Rig Veda, since some tribes got mixed with other tribal groups coming to India from different parts of Asia, and some remain unidentified due to lack of geographical continuation of these tribes. The tribes which are frequently mentioned in the Rig Veda are the Yadu, Turvasha, Puru, Anu, and Druhyu. This federation of 5 tribes is often referred as Panchajanya, wherein these 5 tribes are said to be Aryan tribes, while Alina, Pakta, Bhalana, Shiva, and Vishanin were said to be non-Aryan tribes, though in the later Vedic period, these Aryan and non-Aryan tribes were fused together. In fact, our country is also named after a tribe called Bharatas. They were a tribe who had reference in Rig Veda Mandala 3 attributed to the Bharat sage Vishwamitra. It is believed that Bharat were a Vedic tribe around river Ravi in modern Punjab. The 2 epics, Mahabharata and Ramayana, also give some reference to the tribes prevalent during their time, like the Shudra, Ahira, Pulinda, Shabara, etc. Soon these tribes were absorbed in the Hindu society, and soon they were assigned the tasks of the lower order. For example, the Chandals were given the task of removing dead bodies of human beings and animals, and also scourging and cutting off the limbs of the criminals. Thus, the process of downgrading various tribes and assigning them downgraded tasks continued. Probably this led to the creation of the lower caste referred as Shudras. Since some tribes were looked down and were relegated, so is their tradition, art, and culture. The 5th Ved, known as Natya Shastra or Natya Ved, is the most fundamental treatise and a magnum opus on the performing arts of India. Dance, music, theatre follows the blueprint of Natya Shastra for its execution. But does it also contain some information regarding the dance, music, and theatre of tribal culture, since it has been composed by Bharat Muni in 2nd or 3rd century, as advised by Brahma, in order to create a treatise which is meant for the lower strata of the society, since they didn't had the provision to access the 4 Vedas. Hence, Natya Shastra was created for all castes, all varnas, everyone. Here a question arises that whether Natya Shastra is only accessible to the Shudras, or does it contain some information regarding their art and culture as well. It is generally seen that the dance, music, or theatre, which follows the rules, regulations, and methodology of Natya Shastra for its theory and practice, received the tag of classical. But what about folk and tribal culture, or their dance, music, art, culture? Even though Bharat Muni didn't allude to indigenous traditions, but traces can be found in Natya Shastra that he did touch upon these art forms, majorly during the comparison between the cultivated dance styles, which he calls as Margi or Natya Dharmi, which follows the Shastras for its execution, and the second is the regional dance styles known as Deshi or Lokadharmi, which are the dance compositions with regional effect, which includes the tribal and folk dance forms as well. These classifications prove that even Bharat Muni was aware of the fact that two kinds of dance styles will evolve, one which will be in accordance to rules and principles as laid down in the Natya Shastra, and the other with regional variations, although he didn't deal with the Deshi tradition in full length or didn't give any aesthetic representation of it. Abhinav Bharti, which is a commentary on Natya Shastra written by Abhinav Gupta, is absolutely silent about the Deshi tradition. Also, Bharat Muni didn't name any classical dance explicitly in Natya Shastra, but he classifies 4 regions or styles which he calls as pravriti, from where dance can evolve. These are Avanti, Dakshini, Panchali, and Odhra Magadhi, which are basically the north, south, east, west states, which can be recognized through their dialect, tradition, culture, way of living, etc. Not only classical, but various regional dances, including folk and tribal dance forms, also evolved from these regions. In fact, in chapter 13, where he describes the gaids or the movements when someone walks, he also describes the gaids of the Mlecha tribes, which includes Pulindas, Shabaras, etc. Hence, it can be elucidated that classical texts have acknowledged indigenous inhabitants, although a detailed information about them and their culture is missing. Their culture and tradition is like a precious gem for us. Once it is lost, it will be lost forever. For instance, earlier there were 6 lakh languages in India and now only 6,000 are left. What were the other languages? No one knows. It is lost forever. So there is a lack of written documentation which can give a detailed account of their dance forms, music, instruments, dialects, traditional practices, philosophy, and history. Since these people were unable to read or write, so oral storytelling and folklores were the only way to pass their culture from one generation to another and retain their legacy. Unfortunately, in present time, only few people practice these arts since it doesn't give them a full-fledged livelihood. For some of the arts, these few people are the only bearers. Once it ceases to exist, we will have lost an important part of our civilization forever, and reviving it would be, simply put, impossible. Therefore, a planned documentation of these marginalized indigenous inhabitants and their intangible cultural traits is essential, which is missing in the ancient classical scriptures, and it is also important to make others aware of it by popularizing them. Thank you.
Thank you, Pragya Ghosh, for your very thought-provoking paper. So we have come to the end of this technical session. We have got 4 paper presentations, and on different topics. We started with S. Bharati and her discussion on the representation of islands by Amitav Ghosh. And she discussed how Amitav Ghosh has shown different problems faced by people inhabiting in the islands of Sundarbans, geographical conditions, environmental issues that are affecting the life and economy of the people, and how people from the mainland are treating these people. So it's an interesting area of research that many people can take up. After that, we had Parvati P on the topic indigeneity, orality, and tribal agency, the critical reading of KJ Baby's Maveli Mantram. And it's about the Adia tribe, Adia community in the northeastern part of Kerala, and how these people have been reduced to slavery by different administrative forces, and then how myths and legends, have been taken up as important tool for the reclamation of their tribal identity, both in the literary and the political space. Then the third presenter was Sonal Sharma, represented on the amalgamation of myths and legends and folklore. In the select plays of Girish Karnad, with special reference to Yayati and Nagamandala. Okay, and the fourth paper, Pragya Ghosh, Indigenous Inhabitants in Ancient Scriptures. And it's a very thought-provoking paper in the sense that she dealt with something which have not been discussed much about the tribes, about the indigenous people, who are somewhere in the peripheries of the narratives of Vedas, Upanishads, Puranas, epics, or the Naitya Shastras, Mahabharata Muni. So these are all very interesting papers. Now I would like to take up questions. If anybody has got any question to ask, they can directly ask.
Thank you.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question to Parvati.
Okay, Parvati, please.
Okay, Parvati, in your presentation, you mentioned the word Hindu god. They worship the Hindu god.
Yeah.
Is it mentioned in Maveli Mantram or it's your own perspective?
Okay.
So it is mentioned in the novel. So
Okay.
So it is a Hindu goddess.
Okay.
So the myth of the Adiyas. So it says that the Adiyas were like they were perpetually destined to work as slaves under the landlords of Wayanad. So this goddess, this Hindu goddess Mali, is created, actually a creation of the landlords. So in order to reiterate the fact that this goddess will follow this community members wherever they go, so that they can't never be out of the sight of this landlords. So this mythical conception of the goddess Mali is what the renewed the modern Adiya man and woman are trying to overcome. So the fear of this Mali is what they're trying to overcome. So it is described, it is mentioned in the novel. It's also, this novel is actually based on the song called Pelapattu of the Adiyas. So this goddess name is mentioned in that song also. And this Mali, there is like a ritualistic performance called Gadiga of the Adiya community in Wayanad. So it is performed related to the agricultural festivals, and it is also performed as a healing practice. So the songs of the Adiya, with the songs of this Gadiga practice also mention about this goddess Mali. So yeah, it is a recurring trope, this goddess Mali.
But you talked about oral and tribal society, right? So in oral and tribal society, how can you generalize the deities into a Hindu god?
No, I am not centralizing the deity. I am just saying that the myths actually, myths are subject to change. So the myths, this myth might be an invention of the landlords. So what the novelist is trying is that there is like this, where the Adiyas have to constantly live under the fear of this goddess Mali. But what they have to do is that they have to overcome that fear.
Okay.
So it is not centralized on this, on the myth of the. I mean, it is not centralized on this Hindu goddess.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, is there any other question for the other presenters?
Hi, I have some questions for Priyanka Ghosh.
Pragya Ghosh.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Priyanka. Pragya, sorry. Hi, Pragya. You gave a very nice presentation, very clear and very precise. Congratulations on that.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. I have few concepts which I want to discuss with you. So maybe you can add it into your further research. Now, last year in Cell is one of the world's leading scientific journal. So some scientists from India and America, they conducted the DNA research of North Indians and South Indians and Central Asians, and they denied the Aryan theory given by the colonizers in India.
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah? Because you have mentioned about the Panchjanyas, the Panchjanya tribe, Pandavas and Kurus, of course. So, and 3 others. You said that they are the Aryan tribe. But last year in September and October, the Aryan invasion theory has been nullified. Also, with the establishment that the Saraswati Valley, Saraswati River existed from the north to the Gujarat and to Central Asia, through Central Asia. Again, the Vedic concepts have changed. So, I would like you to next time, whenever you do research, consider these 2 points also. So, though I have lots of questions, but I think that these fundamentals should be explored. Since you are already doing research on it, I think you are the right person to take this research further, considering these parameters also.
Thank you so much, sir, for these insightful points. I'll definitely look into these and I'll incorporate them in my research. Thank you so much, sir.